We'll get started here in just a minute. We're letting people in from the waiting room. Well, I want to welcome everyone today. My name is Lori Haight, and I serve as the Director of Career
I don't know.
Services.
Well, I had never, it's something I
If we
had
could go
considered
ahead
because I wanted
and
to go to law school. And then when I was
mute
like, I think I want to go to library school
people,
instead, I was like, well,
mute.
maybe I still do both. And maybe I.
There we go. Just for some brief introductions before we get started, one of the things we do want to recommend is that as people walk in, for some general housekeeping, that they stay muted while our panelists are sharing. Please turn your camera on if you're comfortable. And we do have some questions to start off with, but we do have some time at the end. So if there are questions that come up, please feel free to put them in the chat, or at that time we can come off mute and ask them. So again, my name is Lori Haight, and I'm the Director of Career Services at UNC Chapel Hill in the School of Information and Library Science. I want to thank you for spending an hour with us today, and I especially want to thank our panelists. I'm going to jump right in and have our panelists introduce themselves. And so if we could start with Mandy.
Hi, everyone. Good to see all of you. My name is Mandy Lee. I'm head of research and instruction at Chicago College of Law in Chicago. I've been in this position since July of last year. Before that, I worked for 5 years as research and instructional services librarian. I have a JD from DePaul, a master's in library science from the University of Illinois. And my first job out of library school is at the University of Nebraska in Lincoln.
Thank you. Kirby, could you go next for us?
Hi, my name is Kirby. I am currently a law librarian in Chicago. I work for Professionals Library Service, which works for a bunch of different law firms. So I work for 4 or 5 different firms in Chicago. I graduated with my MLIS degree from University of Wisconsin-Madison, and this is my first job out of library school.
Great, thank you. Chris, could you introduce yourself, please?
Sure. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Chris Turner. I'm the Associate Director of Public Services at UW-Madison Law Library. I graduated from the UW-Madison High School in 2012 with a Master's in Library Science, and I have a JD from the UW Law School. I graduated in 2020. And yeah, I got this job right as I came out. I have had various positions at the law library since I came out of high school, but I did not have a JD when I started here. And so we'll talk about that a little bit more as we go through.
Thank you. And Laura, can you introduce yourself, please?
Good afternoon. My name is Laura Olson. I serve as Senior Legal Research Specialist at Quarles & Brady, located in Madison, Wisconsin. In 1993, I earned my MALS from the University of Wisconsin High School. I am entering my 30th year of law librarianship. I've been in my current position for 15 years. I just sort of fell into this career, and that's something I want to talk with you all about further. Today, I cannot imagine doing anything else. It's a profession that all 4 of us love. So we're so excited to be speaking with you today, Valentine's Day, about a career that we love. And I work at what's considered a large law firm, about 500 attorneys in 11 offices in 7 US states and about 1,000 total professional staff.
Great, thank you. Well, we have about 5 or 6 general questions, and I would love for the panelists, if they want to answer each question, wonderful. But we'll kind of flow through and see. So please don't feel that only one person can answer each question. During our introductions, I'm glad that you included your path to working in law librarianship. Can we talk about a day in the life of what you do at work? Because I know there's a range, so I'd love to hear some day in the life examples.
Well, I'm happy to kick that off. A day in the life. So again, I'm in a law firm library. And a day in the life is that there are some things that are constant, and then there are some things that are in flux. The pace is fairly fast paced, given sort of just the nature of working in the private sector. Deadlines are a big part of what I do. And I feel like I am paid to learn about all sorts of interesting topics. Any law firm library, if it's larger in scope, has all the same traditional departments you might find in an academic library or a public library. There's collection development and acquisitions and research and reference and bibliographic instruction. My particular role is more focused on research, reference, ready reference, and bibliographic instruction. So a big part of what I do is teaching and training. Teaching people across all levels of our firm how to conduct legal research. So I focus on legal research methodology. I also do a lot of teaching and training on non-legal research, because we're all law librarians here on the panel, but before we're law librarians, we're just librarians. We happen to work in a subject specialty. So I do a lot of teaching and training and bibliographic instruction. The other big part of my job is doing research, and a lot of that could be very, very in-depth research about things of a legal nature. And certainly we do a lot of non-legal research. There's a big emphasis on competitive intelligence, business research, and we dabble in any myriad of various practice areas: products liability, bankruptcy, intellectual property. Two of the areas that I've been working on lately that I find really interesting and fun are working with Indian tribes on Indian and tribal law. And I do a lot of legislative and regulatory monitoring for our tribes to help our tribal clients, to help them keep abreast as to changes in the law that impacts them, and letting them know about legislation that's coming down the pikes that they might want to lobby on. And I've been doing a lot of cannabis law research, which is interesting, not necessarily to me, but certainly to my young adult children. They think that's really cool. Cannabis is a very hot industry right now, and it's laden with a lot of complicated and overlapping and sometimes conflicting laws. So that's just, a very brief overview of day in the life, but it can go in a lot of different directions, and it's not always law specific.
I can go next. It's tough to follow Laura, but I'll do my very, very best. So Laura's in a law firm. I'm in an academic setting. I'm sure you'll hear about more from this from Mandy as well. But so our primary clientele are students and faculty. Those are the first folks that we are working with every day. And it's exciting at UW because we are technically a public library. We are open for anyone to come in and use our resources in the state of Wisconsin. So just yesterday, I was working with pro se litigants who were concerned about some criminal charges that one of their family members had. I get questions from faculty about helping write papers to talk about, hey, how do you do this the correct way? How do you cite this source? Can you find this kind of item? You just never know what you're going to get, which I like about this job. Like Laura said, it's so much fun to see. You never know what the question will be. Like generally it's legal or law research oriented, but it does not necessarily have to be. I oversee the reference and circulation department. So there's a lot of questions about just logistical flows, like how long is the library open? Who's staffing these desks? What kind of services should we offer? Can we do this? Wellness is a big thing right now with students. We kind of straddle the line between an academic setting and a special setting in that way, where you kind of get a little bit of everything here. And finally, I'm also teaching a law school class this semester and did last semester as well. So that's a new thing for me, but it's definitely, I actually came out of undergraduate thinking I was going to teach high school. So it's really nice to be able to apply some of those extra background that I have to say, look, librarianship is a lot like teaching in many ways. And that's kind of come full circle for me in that way.
So I can follow up on Chris's, because as you said, I'm also an academic, but mine's a bit different because Chicago Kent's a private institution. So before the pandemic, we were technically open to the public, but now we're not. So we're only open to current Chicago Kent student, staff, and faculty. So we don't get very many questions from public patrons. But yeah, generally, same sorts of things, teaching, preparing to teach. But our classes are actually just guest lectures in other in professors' classes. So just this morning, Jean Wenger, my director, who's on this call somewhere, she and I co-taught employment law research. And, it varies, like we're going to be teaching like international trade law research coming up, and like the Illinois Trade Secrets Act research, just, a huge range. So anything a professor wants us to teach research wise. And so I do outreach too to faculty to, say, I can come in, my staff can come in, we can come in and present on various topics. And then there is, research for faculty, and I divide that with our student services librarian. So I supervise her, and we take turns covering the research and reference email accounts. But, anytime a student or usually a student might walk in, and just, communication with vendors is another thing I feel like I've been spending quite a bit of time on. Things like, a student yesterday had a problem with like a West Academic casebook she had bought. And, so like, I was communicating with a rep about that, and communicating with the Westlaw Alexis Bloomberg and Illinois Institute for Continuing Legal Education reps, like coordinating, their visits to campus. So those are the primary things that I do.
Kirby, can I jump in really quickly? I used a term that's kind of a technical term, pro se litigant. That means someone that is not represented by a lawyer in a court. They're representing themselves, that they're doing all the legal representation in court. So they don't have a JD, but they may not want to spend the money or don't have the money to hire an attorney. So they're doing all the research themselves. And so it's a nice access to justice things for public law schools, that they can offer these resources to these kind of potential clients and folks that are out there. Sorry, Kirby. Thanks.
You're all good. So my day in the life is pretty different every day, because I do work for a handful of different firms throughout the day. So when I work downtown in the Loop in Chicago, I'll work at one for 3 hours and then walk to another one and work there for 3 hours. And then I'll go home and work for another 2 hours. And every firm is different, and what I do at each firm widely depends on what kind of request I'm getting. Sometimes it's just, can you pull a form to file a motion? Sometimes it's, can you find me all of the arrest numbers and like prosecution numbers for psilocybin in the state of Illinois last year? So it's always a mixed bag, which is really fun because you get to do new research every day.
Thank you. So part of what I heard in those day in the lives is that there are different areas of the law. And so I didn't know if we wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about how just widen what people think of when they think of law librarianship, of where that might actually be taking place. So when we talked as a panel before this presentation, we thought about, Laura mentioned 5 different areas. There was academic, government, corporate, law firms, and then non-traditional roles. So do our panelists want to share any bit in terms of the range of where you can use your law librarianship skills or skill sets?
So I can speak a bit about non-traditional roles, because I've also held a non-traditional role as a law librarian. And I worked for 5 or 6 years for Thomson Reuters, the parent company of Westlaw. Most high school students are very familiar with LexisNexis resources. Westlaw is the primary competitor to LexisNexis in the legal space. So I started my career in a mid-sized law firm, and Westlaw was one of our clients. We represented them in a big copyright case, and they recruited me, and I worked for them kind of in the middle portion of my career thus far. And so I worked for a vendor. At the time, some of my colleagues said I had gone to the dark side, but I'm actually a much better vendor, having worked for a publisher. Or I'm a much better librarian, I should say, having worked for a legal publisher. And I did training. I went to law firms, government agencies, corporations, law schools, and I taught people how to use the research products. And that kind of falls into the non-traditional bucket. I have a couple of colleagues and also a student I hosted in a practicum many years ago who've also taken the non-traditional path. One of the UW-Madison High School graduates, Stephen Weber, also works at Quarles and Brady. He works in our intellectual property docketing, which is somewhat like records management. So he has used his information management knowledge in a records management career. Another colleague of mine who did a practicum with me has worked for multiple sort of tech companies doing user interface design and training. So I think there are sort of niches where we can take our knowledge of information science and research and apply that in a non-traditional, non-library setting.
One developing area in academic law librarianship, at least, is scholarly visibility and scholarly communications. There's been a really big push to help faculty, once they've published a paper, to get it out there and get it cited and get it read. And so librarians are well positioned because of that information management knowledge to help them understand where you get your papers, how you organize it, how you connect them with metadata. Metadata is a term that will not always resonate to law folks. So this is a nice opportunity for librarians to fill that gap in knowledge. And so that's something that we have seen a lot of. We just developed a repository for faculty scholarship and other materials here at Wisconsin about 5 years ago. And it's just blooms like crazy. And we just can't keep up with the work. It's just so much to do and so many things we want to do with it. So that's kind of a specialization within academia, at least, that I think the MLS is much more important than the JD in that situation, because you need to understand how the information is organized and connected first, and then the legal aspect afterwards. But that's one thing that's definitely growing across the US in academia.
Yeah, and as a follow-up question, what percentage do you think of law librarianship positions have both the JD and the MSLS or MSIS or MLS, whichever your program offers you? So is that the majority, is that people have both degrees and or not? And so that's just something I'm interested in while I have a panel in front of me.
I think so. Primarily in academic settings, the JD is often required. Having both the master's in library science, library information science degree, and the JD tends to be required. In other spaces, not necessarily. We do have two of our librarians who have the library information science masters, but not the JDs. And as Chris was mentioning, for scholarly repository type work, one of our librarians, focuses on one of her foci of that. So she doesn't have the JD, and I think it's not necessary for that.
Mm-hmm.
I concur that it's primarily in the academic setting, but we have to realize the academic setting, while one of the most important cornerstones of law librarianship, there are 3 or 4 other sort of settings in which law librarians work, and JDs are not required. And that would include working for a government law library like the Wisconsin State Law Library, working in law firm libraries. Some law firm librarians have JDs, but I would say not the majority. Also, many corporations, large corporations, have in-house legal departments, some of which have libraries. Those also do not require a JD, as well as some of the non-traditional settings. So I think it honestly, in my opinion, it's the biggest thing that turns people away from pursuing or even considering law librarianship, is that there's this expectation that you have to have a JD, which is not true in most non-academic settings. In fact, I just fell into this career. I had zero legal background. I'm the daughter of a lawyer, had zero intention for that reason of going into this field. And I just landed here, and that can happen. In fact, the current issue of the American Association of Law Libraries Spectrum, which is an open access publication freely available at AALL.org. One of the articles is entitled "How a Temporary Position Led to a Law Librarianship Career." And I think, as we've talked with a lot of our colleagues, many of us, fell into this. Maybe we didn't have an intention to go into this because it's not particularly well addressed in library schools.
I'm going to add a little bit of nuance to the academic part. We have 11 academic staff, so full-time librarians at UW. 5 of us, including the director, have a JD MLS. So there's less than half of us that have both, and the rest have all MLSs. which is great because this includes our technical services staff. That's about half, like acquisitions, cataloging. We have a head of cataloging here. That's not always common across law libraries, academic law libraries in the US, but there are some that look for technical services. And it's a very unique area to be cataloging and purchasing in because it's very unique materials. And Wisconsin's probably a little unique, but we don't always necessarily look for a double degree, even if we're looking at public services for reference. If you're teaching, probably we look at both because you're teaching the law school level. That's something that we probably would strongly consider. But even for our outreach and instructional services librarian has an MLS and that's it. And she does an amazing job. She actually came out of the law firm world, and that experience in the work here, it's something I totally agree with Laura that sometimes it's a misconception that you need that dual degree. And Mandy is right that academics probably where it's most commonly required for both, but even then, not necessarily.
Great.
There's a thing in law librarianship where you're a librarian where you're a JD first and then an MLS, or a Libyer where you had the MLS first and then the JD. And I think that we're all pretty fairly safe to say that we're probably all MLS first, but that's just my opinion.
I do know that there's some dual degree programs, so that's interesting too, that it seems like the majority were 1 degree at a time. So that's interesting. So we have a few questions we wanted to ask specifically for students in librarianship programs about gaining experience that would resonate with future law librarianship type roles. So one question is, what are some ways to get experience as a student that would resonate with future employers in law librarianship roles? And then we'll go in a little bit into professional development opportunities. So first about experience. What does that look like if you are in the position to hire someone? Some of you have mentioned you were practicum supervisors, or there's people that have newly started at your organizations. Like, what was something that popped out in as having not as much experience?
I can start. So, I mean, ideally, obviously, law library experience. So whether that's, an internship, as you mentioned, Lori, a practicum, or some other kind of experience in the law library. The University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, they have a graduate assistantship program, which pre-pandemic it was on campus. So I actually moved down to Champaign, Illinois for that, to work 20 hours a week in the law library. And most of the time was on the reference desk, also teaching. So I learned a lot through that. And I think since the pandemic, it's been remote. But I do know of someone who lives in a completely different state and is doing the remote work, whether I'm not actually sure if it's for credit or not, but she's getting law library experience through the U of Illinois Law Library. So try to find some kind of experience in a law library, and then otherwise there's some remote internships, such as like at the Law Library of Congress or other places. And then if you can't get law library experience, then any libraries, because we're saying we're librarians, so any library would still be good to have experience in. And then ultimately, I feel like we're about service, because we're serving our patrons. So I mean, even other kinds of customer service experience, if you can't get any other library experience, that still is helpful.
I guess I could follow up a little bit on that. I think part of the challenge for folks in library school and recent graduates is, and I vividly remember this, even though it's 30 years ago now, is you can't get a job without experience, right? But yet, if you don't have experience, how are you going to get a job? So I was in that position and just lucked out that a law firm hired me. And the message that I tried to sell that I was curious. I was a self-starter. I took initiative and I was willing to learn and just throw myself all in. And I've done a fair amount of hiring in recent years, or helped with hiring in recent years in the law firm setting. And those are exactly the kind of skills that we're looking for from folks who don't have the the type of traditional experience. And certainly the events of the last 3 years have really impacted people's abilities to get experience. I think just the ability to think critically and to have an analytical mind, you have to start somewhere. And I think iSchools provide a very solid foundation. And then some of it is on the onus of new graduates and recent applicants to just say, I'm going to run with this and I'm going to learn everything that I can.
I'd add to that, you could look into learning more about legal specific resources, like Laura had mentioned Westlaw and something like LexisNexis. If you're able to say that I at least have a cursory understanding of some very specific legal resources, that's a really helpful thing, because legal research is sometimes so specific in that way. Just that'll stand out to me, like, oh, you have at least understood that there is specific something beyond JSTOR or something like that that you may be more familiar with for general research. You still use that at least in academic law librarianship, but if you're like, okay, how do you go deeper for just our kind of research, that would really help, I'd say. And then we have an intern practicum program at the UW School where folks such as Kirby Bright have joined us in the UW Law Library as a practicum student, and so that's really helpful just to say that you have worked with it, you kind of know the environment. I think Kirby, you were here during the pandemic, so it was a little different. Normally we'd have someone, in person, but we still were able to work with you remotely to show you kind of how the sausage is made at the time. But that if you seek out those kind of practicum opportunities, hopefully there would be a law library, like Mandy was saying, that would be able to accommodate you either virtually, hybrid, or in person.
And I would add that networking could help. I know of someone who's an aspiring law librarian. She wants to get a job working in a law library, and either in a government or academic setting. And so she, through her iSchool, had an internship at one law library, but then, communicated with her colleagues there about her interest in also trying out a government law library, and got in touch with the local professional association, Chicago Association of Law Libraries, and met people through that, and now has some externship or internship or something at a government law library.
Yeah, Mandy, that's a great segue to our next question in terms of professional development opportunities at the state and the national level. And so, as you were saying, they could offer some practical experience that could build on your resume. But are there other, what has been your experience with professional development opportunities and associations in the realm of law librarianship? And have they been helpful to you in your career?
I can kick that one off. When I entered the profession 30 years ago, I knew nothing about law librarianship, and I would not be where I am today if it wasn't for the mentoring that I received through professional associations and the formal and informal connections I made through these organizations. It was just really critical. So our national organization is the American Association of Law Libraries, is headquartered in Chicago. There are 28 state and regional chapters of the American Association of Law Libraries. For example, I think we have at least, I noticed one Wisconsin student on this call, if not more. So we have the Law Librarians Association of Wisconsin. We have both in-person and virtual meetings, including a virtual meeting on Thursday. There's also the Special Libraries Association, and it has a legal division called the Legal Chapter. And these provide opportunities to learn. It also provides opportunities to network both formally and informally. And the AALL has a pretty strong mentorship program. In fact, that is the key, the cover page story of the current issue. And I just cannot emphasize enough the value of these professional organizations for education, networking, professional growth, and development. And just the connections that you make with people and the ability to bounce ideas off of someone. In fact, sometimes it's easier to bounce an idea off a colleague in a different workplace than in your own workplace, because you don't want to seem like an idiot in your own workplace, but you can talk a little more freely outside of your workplace. So I cannot emphasize enough the value of professional engagement in professional associations, and all of them offer student memberships. And I know we would love to welcome you all in Chicago and Wisconsin, elsewhere. So do check out aallnet.org and look at your regional and local state chapters.
And to follow up on that, associations may usually offer things like grants or some, may offer scholarships. So as a student right now, for those of you, library students or law students, there are many opportunities out there. And also grants to go to things like the AAA annual meeting, conferences of various sorts. So please apply to all of those. And I think another aspect of benefit of the professional associations is developing leadership skills and just interacting with a great group of people. So I've made great friends over the years around the country through the associations. And Chicago Association of Law Libraries, for anyone interested, we're going to have an in-person, if you're in Chicago, a networking event on a Monday or Tuesday, February 28th at Revival Food Hall at 9 in the morning or 8 in the morning. And then we'll have one on Zoom if you can't attend that. So it'll be Monday, March 27th at 9 in the morning. These are Central Time. So if you want more information, you can contact me about those. So just for new members or people interested in law librarianship.
That's great information. Thank you. And I'm really excited that you mentioned not only the student rate, but that there's the grants and things to apply to, because I think a lot of times if students don't know about them, then they're not reaching out and making those connections. So thank you. Our last question that we had that we wanted to ask before we open it up to the general audience is, are there myths around law librarianship that aren't really accurate that you could share with us today to kind of demystify the process of working in law librarianship in the future?
I'll go. I mean, I know we've covered it, but I'll reiterate, like, you don't need a JD. I don't have a JD and I don't plan on getting a JD. So don't worry about that if you're interested. And like another thing that always kind of like scared me a little bit is when you're doing research for attorneys, if you go that route, like, it's obviously awesome to like completely know what's going on, but it's also not your job to interpret the law. So don't get caught up in that, like being like, this doesn't make sense, because like, it doesn't have to make sense to me. I'm just doing the research, finding them resources. I don't have to worry about interpreting because that's not my job.
That's a great point, Kirby. I'm going to build off of that one. I mentioned the public patrons that we get sometimes. I will get, just as if you're working at a public library, you will get a call and say, I want the answer to this. The question sometimes is, I've just been charged with this. What do I do next? And the answer then is, I'm not your lawyer, or I'm not a lawyer, but I can help you find information. And so you're just relying on the same skills you'd use as a librarian in a public library or an academic library to help them connect with resources that would help them. And I think that anytime you're talking to somebody about the law or medical issues or even public information issues, they're probably a little bit stressed. And so you're going to see a lot of those same situations in the public area and an academic field that you'll see in law librarianship if you're working in public services. And again, Kirby is right. The most obvious myth that we want to dissipate here is that you need a dual degree. You can do that if you want to do some of the higher level. If you want to get up to be like a director of an academic law library, they're definitely going to want a dual degree and things like that. But it is not something that's going to bar the gates for, I'd say 60, maybe even 70% of the law librarian jobs that are out there. And when you look at corporate, law firm, special, academic. So that's the biggest one I think I would just want to disabuse for you to take away.
Another myth I would like to dispel is that we only work with legal content, because while that is much of what we deal with the types of content that somebody at a public library reference desk would deal with. And I'll just illustrate this with a point. We had a case in which we represented American Girl dolls, headquartered in Wisconsin, owned by Mattel. And American Girl came out with a doll that looked like a famous astronaut. And it was a big intellectual property lawsuit. And I spent, several days researching US Census Bureau data on popular names because we wanted to prove that the doll's name was not a knockoff of this astronaut's name. And we proved that through data. And I used government data. So it's not all law related, and it gets, pretty interesting. Many of my law librarian friends and I always say we should be on a game show because we have all this extraneous information, all these facts that we've learned. So it's not all law specific, at least in the maybe the private sector component of law librarianship.
Well, that's very helpful. Thank you. At this point, if there are any questions that our audience has, you're welcome to use the chat to type it in. Or if you want to raise your hand and I can take you off mute and you can ask it out loud. We are recording, so sometimes people would prefer chat so they don't have to, like I'm doing here myself, speak into the video later when we share this. But we did want to let you have some time for questions. Part of the reason that the iSchools across North America created the GLAMJam series is for this exploration. And so the career panels aspect of it is an important resource in terms of helping our students understand what different careers are out there and what encompasses those careers. So please feel free to ask away. So I'll stop talking so people can type. And let's see if any questions come up. Okay, see, it always works as soon as I stop saying stuff. So our first question, does the panel have any tips about search strategies for finding law librarianship jobs?
Go to the American Association of Law Libraries website, and there is a career section there. There's also a very useful document there called the Body of Knowledge, BOK. I'm currently serving on the Body of Knowledge Review Committee, and that talks about core competencies in law librarianship. So you could look at for the skills that are recommended and hone your cover letter and your resume to address those skills. But you just have to go to either the national or the state local chapters, and there's lots of information on placement.
Yep,
Thank
I
you.
agree. That's where we post all of our jobs there, among various other places, but the same goes for, I believe, a lot of law firms also post on AALL's career options. So that's a great place to start. If you're looking at government jobs, like a state law librarian, that's usually through the state. They also try to get it through AALL, but also just check for the state level positions as well is a good place.
Great. Our next question was, if your interest is in data science type roles, do you find a need for data science in your roles beyond the notion of accessing digital resources?
We're seeing a lot more requests for empirical research in data sciences from faculty. They say they don't want to kind of rely on existing content and existing data. They want to create their own. And like, how do we do this? Where do we house it? How do you treat this data correctly? So it is definitely a growing field, and we have a gap in our staff right now. We kind of have to defer to other university librarians for that expertise. And I think it's growing is where I'd say. I don't think correct me if I'm wrong, other panelists, but I haven't seen a direct outright data scientist law librarian position, but I think it's coming very soon, or it's going to be built in heavily into existing positions.
And I think there are data science components, I think, within the job, not a specific job directed at data science, but a big trend of late is legal analytics, looking at metrics and analytics and predictive outcomes, like how might a judge lean in this case, and that really is based on the foundations of data science.
Our next question was, how would you describe the work-life balance compared to other subfields of librarianship?
I think it depends on your role and on your position and the company you work for. I'm really grateful for the company I work for. I have set hours and I'm never working past 5 and I've never worked past 2 on a Friday. but it also depends on your company. Like I've seen postings for some jobs where if it's a reference librarian for a law firm, you might have to be available on weekends, or they'll have you working weird hour shifts from like 12 p.m. to 8 p.m. It really depends on the position and the posting. But I myself find I have a great work-life balance.
Yeah, we have most of the staff that work here have set schedules. It might be a little bit less in some cases than a public library, for example, just because we have more limited hours on the weekends for reference staff at least. So in that way, you might have to say, okay, I'm working this set hours, more 9 to 5-ish, but occasional weekends because we rotate the weekend shifts. But I found when I was working in public libraries, they're like, okay, I'm working a Saturday, a full day, like twice a month or something like that. So it might be a little bit more tend to work-life balance in some of the professions, but Kirby's right. It depends on your position in law librarianship, just like it would in public or academic or other types of libraries as well.
I think it also depends on the boundaries that you set for yourself. I'm not a great person to answer this question because I work in a large national law firm. Sometimes there are pressures to stay late to meet a deadline, but they're also, on the flip side, they've been incredibly flexible with me. I'm a single parent and have been for a long time. So if I need flexibility to take my child to the doctor or take my parents to the doctor, as the case now is, it's a give and take. So there are times I put in extra because that's what's needed. And I want to. I've become pretty intimately involved with some of the clients we serve, and I care about them. And so I work extra sometimes, but then I have flexibility. So it's a give and take. But I think the most important thing, and I didn't do this early on in my career, is to set boundaries for yourself and to put yourself first. And if you ever feel like those boundaries are being pushed, just advocate for yourself. That can be sometimes tough in the private law firm environment.
And I think even in academic, at least for me, preparing for classes, that can take, even though they're just, one-time presentations, can take a lot of time. So I used to spend, a lot of evenings and weekends. I think I do that less now because I've, prepared more over time, and I can, kind of just refresh the material I've prepared in the past, but also because it's not so sustainable. So I'm not doing that as much. But we also did hire, another staff person. So the work is a little bit more distributed.
And this is stuff that we're aware of as librarians as well. Like as a manager, we take wellness pretty seriously for our staff, but also the students that use the library. So we're always trying to make sure that work-life balance and just wellness in general is at the forefront of our minds for these kind of things.
We had another question about how long does the job search process usually take? If someone finishes in May 2024, so 15 months away, what would that cycle look like? When would they start applying?
I'm going to guess, I could be wrong, Laura and Kirby especially, but I think academic probably takes a little bit longer than the private. I'd say if we started to hire, like if we posted something today, we probably would be hiring to start in June or July, roughly, to give you an idea, because we have to go through the entire search process. As a public university, we have to hit certain guidelines and make sure it's as transparent as possible. But that hopefully would give you an idea. So if you're graduating next year in May, if you want to start looking, maybe January-ish, I'd say, or maybe even a little bit earlier just to see what's out there would probably be a good bet. But feel free to contradict me, anybody, on that one.
In the private law firm sector, it's a little more rapid. I would say like it's a 1 to 2 month process, but I think we have hired like students who were about to graduate and they were part-time until they, graduated and could start full-time. So I think for the right candidate, employers are willing to be flexible and adaptable.
I'd say, it does move faster in private. I'm coming up on my 2-year anniversary with this job in May. So this still does like feel very new for me, but I remember applying for jobs 2 years ago and just feeling so discouraged and, you know, hitting apply and being like, here's another job I won't hear from. And when I applied for the job I have now, I did hear back from them like the next day, and within I think like a month they had offered me the position. So you just have to like keep applying. It sounds so cliche, but like there are jobs and positions available. And if you see a job that you really want and it's like right now and you're like, oh, well, I don't graduate till May. If they really like you, they'll be willing to work with you and find a way for you to start in May. So if you like a job, apply for it.
Totally agree. But we've been flexible like that before, where someone isn't available until X date. We're like, that's the person we want. And so we will make it work.
Great. Thank you very much for all of that wonderful feedback. And again, to remind the guests on our panel today that all of the participating iSchools that make up the GLAMJam have people in positions there to help you with job search and job search prep and job search practice and things like that. So it's great to hear from the panelists who are living that life, but then don't feel like you have to have all the answers solved today on your job search strategy. So I think that's great. I wanted to mention that we have one more GLAMJam panel coming up for anyone who'd like to participate. This Friday is our Careers in Archives. But otherwise, I don't see any more questions in the chat. So I want to take a moment to thank our panelists for your time today and all the great information you shared. And I think that it's such a wonderful thing for students to see that how kind and welcoming and forthcoming the people that are doing this work every day are. So to not make it so unattainable. So thank you very much for taking your time today. I'm going to stop recording.